Good day everyone, I am Princess Dayandi de los Reyes from BS Ed English 3B. Now, let's talk about the literary movement period of Enlightenment. Enlightenment from the 17th to 18th centuries. Enlightenment is an intellectual movement in France and other parts of Europe that emphasize the importance of reason, progress, and liberty. So, Enlightenment is a really important period in history. Imagine Europe roughly from the mid-1600s to the late 700s buzzing with new ideas. This wasn't just about science, though that was a big part of it, but about how people thought about everything, including themselves, society, and even how stories should be told. This is the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. Think of it this way: before the Enlightenment, a lot of emphasis was placed on tradition, authority, like the church or monarchs, and accepting things as they were. People often relied on faith and superstition to explain the world. But during the Enlightenment, thinkers started saying, "Hold on a minute, let's use reason to understand things." They believed that through logic and observation, we could make progress and improve society. The Enlightenment, sometimes called the Age of Reason, is primarily associated with non-fiction writing such as essays and philosophical treatises. Now, how does this relate to literature? Well, the Enlightenment wasn't primarily a literary movement in the sense that it produced tons of novels or poems like, they say, the Romantic period that came later. Its main focus was on non-fiction. Think of essays, philosophical treatises, and political writings. These were the vehicles for spreading Enlightenment ideas. Major Enlightenment writers include John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, René Descartes, and Thomas Hobbes. So, for example, writers like John Locke argued for natural rights and limited government. His ideas, though expressed in essays, profoundly influenced how people thought about freedom and governance, themes that later found their way into literature. Similarly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau explored ideas about human nature and society. His philosophical works, while not novels, influenced how writers depict characters and social relationships in the future. Thinkers like René Descartes, with his famous "I think, therefore I am," emphasized the power of individual reason, and this idea of individual, their thoughts, and their experiences became a central theme in later literature. It shifted the focus from grand epic stories to more personal narratives. Lastly, Thomas Hobbes. This main contribution was in the realm of political philosophy, and his most famous work is a book called Leviathan 1651, and in Leviathan, Hobbes presents a really influential idea called the social contract. Imagine a world without any government or rules. Hobbes called this the state of nature. He believed that in such a state, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, it would be a chaotic free-for-all where everyone is looking out for themselves and survival is a constant struggle.
So, these are some famous literary works from the Age of Enlightenment. First is The Social Contract and Confessions by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The social contract explores the concept of a social contract where individuals give up some freedom to a sovereign power in exchange for protection and a just society. It emphasizes the general will and popular sovereignty. Next is the Confessions, a deeply personal autobiography where Rousseau candidly recounts his life, thoughts, and feelings, exploring themes of self-awareness, guilt, and the complexities of human nature. Another literary works is An Essay on Criticism and the Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. So, An Essay on Criticism, a witty and insightful poem that lays out guidelines for good criticism, emphasizing balance, good sense, and the importance of understanding classical rules while also valuing individual genius. So, The Rape of the Lock, a mock heroic poem that satirizes the trivialities and vanities of high society by recounting a seemingly scandalous event, which is the theft of a lock of hair with epic grandeur and humor. Next is an essay concerning human understanding by John Locke, a foundational work of empiricism arguing that the mind is a blank slate at birth and that knowledge comes from the sensory experience. It explores the nature of human understanding, the limits of knowledge, and the importance of reason and observation. Next is the Candide by Voltaire, a satirical novel that critiques philosophical optimism and the idea that all is for the best. In this best of all possible worlds, through the native protagonist Candide's misadventures, Voltaire exposes the harsh realities of suffering, injustice, and human folly. Next is the Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, a satirical novel that uses fantastical voyages to different lands to critique various aspects of human nature and society. Each of Gulliver's journeys serves as an allegory for social, political, and philosophical issues, from the pettiness of human conflicts to the absurdity of certain customs and institutions. Lastly is the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, a political philosophy masterpiece that argues for a strong, centralized government to maintain social order and prevent the war of all against all that would exist in a state of nature. It explores the nature of sovereignty, law, and the social contract, advocating for a powerful sovereign to ensure security and stability.
Let's proceed to the expanding on the nature of Enlightenment literature. Satire as a tool. While nonfiction was dominant, satire became a powerful tool during the Enlightenment, and writers used wit and humor to critique societal ills, religious hypocrisy, and political corruption. Think of Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travel, while published slightly before the traditional start of the Enlightenment. It embodies its spirit, or Voltaire's Candide. These works, while fictional, were deeply engaged with the philosophical and social debates of the time. They use fictional narratives to explore real-world problems and promote Enlightenment ideals. The rise of the novel. While the Enlightenment wasn't primarily a novel-writing period, the seeds of the novel's rise were sown during this time. The focus on individuals' experience, reason, or social critique created fertile ground for the novel to flourish in the subsequent Romantic and realistic periods. Early novels like those by Samuel Richardson, Pamela, and Henry Fielding, Tom Jones, while not strictly Enlightenment works, reflect some of its values by exploring individual lives and social issues. They demonstrate a shift towards more realistic and secular storytelling, and emphasis on realism and rationality. Enlightenment literature, even when fictional, often emphasized realism and rationality. There was a move away from the fantastical and supernatural towards representing the world as it was, understood through reason and observation. Characters were more likely to be driven by logic and self-interest than by faith or divine intervention. Next is public discourse and salons. The Enlightenment wasn't just about individual thinkers, it was a social movement. Salons, coffee houses, and other public spaces became crucial centers for intellectual exchange. These gatherings fostered debate and help disseminate Enlightenment ideas. This emphasis on public discourse also influenced literature, making it more accessible and relevant to a wider audience. Connecting to later literary movements. Bridge to Romanticism. While seemingly opposed to Romanticism, the Enlightenment actually laid some groundwork for it. The Enlightenment's emphasis on individual experience and the exploration of human nature, albeit through the lens of reason, paved the way for the romantic focus on emotion and subjectivity. Romantic writers often grappled with the legacy of the Enlightenment, sometimes celebrating its ideals of progress and freedom, and other times critiquing its emphasis on rationality at the expense of feeling. Influence on realism. The Enlightenment's focus on observation, reason, and social critique directly influenced the rise of realism in the 19th century. Realist writers sought to depict the world as it truly was, often exposing social problems and exploring the lives of ordinary people. They inherited the Enlightenment's commitment to reason and progress, but also its critical perspective on society. Adding to the list of key figures, Mary Wollstonecraft, a significant figure who advocated for women's rights and education during the Enlightenment. Her work of vindication of the rights of women is a powerful example of Enlightenment ideals applied to the social reform. Immanuel Kant, while primarily a philosopher, Kant's ideas about reason, knowledge, and morality profoundly influenced literature and culture. By adding these points, you can paint a richer picture of the Enlightenment's complex and lasting influence on literature. It wasn't just about what was written during the period, but how it fundamentally shifted the way people thought about the world and consequently how stories would be told for centuries to come. So, while the Enlightenment itself wasn't necessarily producing novels in the way we think of them, it was laying the groundwork for how stories would be told. It championed reason, individualism, and progress, ideas that seep into the literature that followed. It encouraged writers to explore characters' inner lives, to question social norms, and to think critically about the world, all things that are still relevant in literature today. In short, the Enlightenment was less about writing fiction and more about changing the way people thought, which in turn influenced what and how writers would eventually write. It was a revolution of ideas that paved the way for modern literature. I think that would be all. Thank you and God bless.